This is the BBC. For details of our complete range of programmes, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.
Welcome to the latest global news recorded at 13 hours GMT on Friday the 28th of April. I'm Jackie Leonard with a selection of highlights from across BBC World Service News today. Coming up, Washington signals it may be willing to negotiate with the North Korean leader.
We do not seek regime change. We seek a denuclearized Korean Peninsula. And again, that is entirely consistent with the objectives of others in the region as well.
So is the US administration changing its approach towards North Korea? Pope Francis visits Egypt 3 weeks after the bomb attacks on 2 Coptic churches killed dozens of people. A top obstetrician resigns over plans to relocate Ireland's national maternity hospital to a site owned by nuns.
The Sisters' ethical code specifically bans things like IVF, sterilisation, abortion, and these, of course, are part and parcel of the daily work of any maternity service.
And as it's Friday, we'll hear about some of the more unusual stories making the news from elsewhere. In a new interview with US National Public Radio, the American Secretary of State Rex Tillerson says the US would accept the continuation of the regime in Pyongyang if it renounced nuclear weapons.
If you listen to the North Koreans and the regime in Pyongyang, their reason for having nuclear weapons is they believe it is their only pathway to secure the ongoing existence of their regime. We do not seek regime change. We do not seek an accelerated reunification of the peninsula. We seek a denuclearized Korean Peninsula. And again, that is entirely consistent with the objectives of others in the region as well.
This follows President Trump's warning that a major conflict could break out with Kim Jong-un's regime over its nuclear and missile programs.
Well, there's a chance that we could end up having a major conflict with North Korea. Absolutely.
Valerie Sanderson spoke to our correspondent in Seoul, Steve Evans, and asked if Mr. Tillerson's interview signalled a fresh approach towards North Korea.
It certainly seems to be, and it's certainly a new tone from 2 weeks ago when it was all war. It certainly seems to be a new strategy from the Obama policy, which was strategic patience. No talking to North Korea, tough sanctions, and then wait for the regime to collapse or to change its mind. Mr. Tillerson to NPR, according to NPR itself, and it's not an organisation to make these things up, says, if you listen to the North Korean, their reasons for having nuclear weapons is they believe it's their only pathway to secure the ongoing existence of their regime. Regime is the word to use. We hope to convince them that you do not need these weapons to secure the existence of your regime. So we hope to convince them. In other words, the deal would be you say you get rid of, or you do get rid of your nuclear weapons, the ones you've developed so far, and we do not seek a collapse of the regime. That's what Mr. Tillerson says. So that is deal-making. Mr. Trump has also praised China today, and President Xi in particular, for his help on North Korea. So you can surmise that what's actually going on is that China is going to North Korea, or making it known to North Korea, this guy's serious in Washington. When he talks tough, he may just do it, but he's giving you a way of securing your own future. That's the way you would read what's coming out of Washington at the moment.
And talking about reading between the lines, do you think Pyongyang would stop developing nuclear weapons? Any sign of that if they were promised to be left in peace?
Absolutely no sign of it at all. And when a deal was done previously, they cheated on it. So there would have to be, and we're a long way down the road if this is going to happen, there would have to be all kinds of guarantees in place. But a deal has been done in the past, and it required pretty heavy monitoring. A more likely possibility, again, way down the line, we're nowhere near that yet, would be a cap on nuclear weapons, maybe a cap short of an ICBM, a missile capable of reaching the US, and an awful lot of monitoring in return for an awful lot of money and guarantees brokered through China that Kim Jong-un keeps his power. That you could imagine being a deal, again, way down the line.
That was Steve Evans in Seoul. Meanwhile, the US-backed deal with Tehran over its nuclear ambitions is centre stage today as Iran's presidential candidates take part in the first of a series of 3 televised debates. Shaima Khalil spoke to an Iranian analyst with Middle East Eye, Marhan Abedin. So how important is the nuclear deal for the forthcoming presidential elections?
Unlike the United States presidential elections, none of the candidates in the Iranian elections are actually talking about tearing up the nuclear deal. The incumbent Hassan Rouhani, he was instrumental at securing the deal following his election in 2013. So he obviously is a strong supporter of it. But even his main challenger, Mr. Ebrahim Raisi, I mean, he's committed to the deal. But I suspect what he and some of the other challengers, notably Mohammad Baqir Ghalibaf, he's a Tehran mayor, he's also a conservative candidate. They will be talking about, the very slow sanctions relief pursuant to the nuclear deal. Obviously, when the deal was forged 18 months ago, most, if not all of the main sanctions were to be lifted. Many of them haven't, particularly those pertaining to the finance sector, banking, etc. So they will be flagging that up as a weakness on the part of the Iranian government.
But of course, the incumbent president, Hassan Rouhani, as you say, he was instrumental. He's going to try and sell that still as a victory for the Iranian government and the Iranian people.
Well, he has to, because when he campaigned 4 years ago, he campaigned on the platform of securing a deal, removing sanctions, and thereby saving the Iranian economy. And this has been his main achievement the past 4 days. So he has to come out and very strongly defend that.
I remember the 2009 elections, the results, but also the election process was very controversial. People took to the streets at the time. If you remember, how will these debates differ in structure from those in 2009?
Well, the elections in 2009 was disputed, and it led to protests and even rioting. What the establishment and the media said back then was that one of the reasons for the polarization which occurred in the June 2009 election was that the debates were one-on-one, and they were quite long, just over an hour, with the main candidates, having a real go at each other, bringing up embarrassing information, and that led to, a very, very tense atmosphere, which some analysts said contributed, to the post-election protests and rioting. I think the authorities learned their lesson, and in the last presidential elections in 2013, the debating was as a panel platform, and that's how they will take place later today. There will be a panel involving all 6 candidates.
And will people be glued to their TVs? What's the public saying about these debates?
Well, the Iranian presidential elections, even though they're tightly controlled insofar as who can get in, nevertheless, they're extremely important, and the public recognizes that, and that's why usually voter turnout is quite high. And, Iranians are a politicized people, so absolutely, millions will be tuning in today to look at these candidates.
Of the candidates that you mentioned, who are you expecting to do well in the election? Well, the debates and then the election.
Well, Rouhani's main contender is Ebrahim Raisi. He's the custodian of the Imam Reza Shrine in Mashhad in northeastern Iran, and by extension, the vast business empire attached to that shrine. He's an establishment favorite, close to the supreme leader Ayatollah Khamenei. However, his background is in the judiciary. He has no political experience, and he's therefore an unknown political quantity.
That was Marhan Abedin. The man who was chosen to take over from Marine Le Pen as interim president of the French National Front has himself stood down. He's at the centre of a row over comments he's alleged to have made about the Holocaust. Hugh Schofield in Paris has the details.
Jean-François Jalc is a veteran of the Front National going back to the earliest days under Marine Le Pen's father, Jean-Marie. Early this week he was named as the party's interim leader while Marine Le Pen focuses on the presidential election. But immediately an old interview was brought to public attention in which, according to his accusers, Mr. Jalc appeared to raise questions over the Holocaust. In the interview made in 2000 with a newspaper journalist, he distinguished between serious negationists or Holocaust deniers and non-serious ones. Serious ones, he said, had some proper historical arguments. For example, the use of the agent Zyklon B in the gas chambers was open to question, he said, because its use for mass extermination would have been impractical. Today, Mr. Jalc denies making the comments and has promised to sue for libel. But it's the sort of row that Marine Le Pen cannot afford at this moment as she fights for the presidency. So Mr. Jalc has been obliged to stand down, replaced by Steve Briouat, who's one of Marine Le Pen's most trusted lieutenants.
That was Hugh Schofield in Paris. More than 10,000 human organs are sold illegally every year, according to the World Health Organization. Billions of dollars are tied up in the trade, with the Middle East now considered the global hub, driven partly by desperate refugees eager to make money by selling their organs. We heard earlier this week about the organ trade in Lebanon. Nawal Al-Maghafi now reports from Egypt, home to the largest number of illegal operations.
Cairo, one of the Middle East's main business hubs, but now a darker trade is thriving. The network is wide, from migrant smugglers to some of Egypt's leading doctors. A crumbling health system and shortage of organs has meant that people wait for years, so turn to the black market, where profits are huge.
If you've got money, anything is possible.
This man matches up those wanting to buy with those desperate enough to want to sell their organs. Conflict in the Middle East has made his job easier. What he's doing is illegal, but he now claims to feel remorse, so explains the trade to us.
People came to me wanting to sell their organ to pay to be smuggled abroad. Money never lasts long, but the promise of a safe life and opportunities overseas are a pretty good incentive.
Organ donation is complicated here. No money can change hands, and you can only donate to someone from the same nationality. But there are always ways to get around the law.
If someone's got dark skin, for example, they could pass as Sudanese. The brokers just make him a fake passport. You can buy the passports from the streets. It's really not a big deal.
Authorities claim they're trying to crack down on this trade. Last year, they conducted a raid of multiple clinics, resulting in the arrest of 45 people, among them doctors and nurses. Millions of dollars were recovered. Yet for many, the profits outweigh the risk.
We're on our way to meet a doctor who we've been told works as a surgeon within the organ trade. We're going in undercover, and our story is that my father's in desperate need of a kidney transplant, but can't find a donor.
Medical costs for a legal transplant are around $3,000, but we've been told to say we'll pay whatever's necessary. This is illegal. Dr. Ahmed Mustafa works for the police. He reassures us that he can help.
I'll call the clinic and ask about getting you a kidney. It's going to be around $40,000. That includes everything. The donor won't take the money directly. You leave their cash at the clinic. The donor will go into the operating theatre, and you'll be told where to leave the cash. I just take half, $20,000.
People come from across the Middle East to buy kidneys. Undercover, I meet a man who was on the government waiting list for months, until his health deteriorated to the point that his family decided to buy a kidney.
When I first got ill, I didn't want the operation, but I changed my mind when someone I knew had it done, and I realised it was the only way I'd be well again. On the surface, it looks legal and above board, but in reality, it's illegal, and that's because of the money.
I ask him, what if something happens to the donor? Will I not be held responsible?
The Ministry of Health has to sign off the surgery, and that doesn't happen unless the donor signs a contract. It says he agrees and that he wasn't paid for his organ, even though he was. Of course, there will be no proof that you paid for the organ.
During our investigation, we learnt of a man who died after selling his kidney. The risks are huge, but so is the desperation for a better life. And with no control in place, there'll be no stopping the organ trade.
That report from Egypt by Nawal Al-Maghafi. You're listening to Global News, the most important stories and the best interviews and on-the-spot reporting from the BBC World Service. And remember that every weekend you can hear a review of the week's main news stories and why they matter. That's in the world this week. Here's Jonathan Marcus to tell us what's in the latest edition.
This week it's all about change, a significant shift in the US approach to the crisis with North Korea as it installs a missile defence system in the south. Are the contours of a new Trump administration policy emerging? How will this go down in South Korea? And does this new policy have any chance of success? We'll be looking at the end of an era in Central Africa, with US and Ugandan forces declaring mission accomplished in their struggle against Joseph Kony and the Lord's Resistance Army, a group that has terrorised a large part of the region for some 30 years. After its robbery of the century, Paraguay is facing an organised criminal threat on an almost military scale. What can be done? And here in London, Johnny Diamond gives us his reflections on the emerging election campaign. Is it an unexpected and unwanted contest, or perhaps one of the most significant political struggles of recent years?
That's all in the world this week with Jonathan Marcus, broadcast over the weekend and available to download from our website. Pope Francis has arrived in Egypt for a visit aimed at fostering reconciliation and dialogue between the Christian and Muslim faiths. He'll show his support for the country's Christian community in the aftermath of bomb attacks on churches that have killed dozens of people. Orla Guerin is following the visit in Cairo.
Pope Francis has touched down in a country under a state of emergency. That was imposed earlier this month after the twin bomb attacks on Palm Sunday 3 weekends ago, in which almost 50 people were killed. Now, after that, the army was deployed at sensitive installations around the country, including Christian churches. Here in Cairo, there has been a redoubling of security in the areas through which the Pope will travel. We have seen a lot of barricades in place, heavily armed police and armed troops, armoured vehicles at strategic locations. Parked cars have been removed from streets that the Pope will be travelling on. Passengers are being moved along. We've also had some house-to-house searches in the last few days. So there is no doubt the authorities are keenly aware, both the Egyptian authorities and church officials, that this is a risky trip, that the so-called Islamic State could decide that they would try and repeat what they have been doing and carry out another attack on Christian targets while the Pope is here and try to hijack the headlines. So-called IS has said in recent months that Christians are their favourite prey, and they have managed to carry out 3 bomb attacks in recent months. Now, one of those bombed churches was here in Cairo, a church called St. Peter and Paul's. That was hit back in December, and almost 30 mass-goers were killed. The Pope himself will be visiting that church this afternoon. He will go to light candles and to say prayers for the dead.
It is a lightning visit, though, isn't it, Orla? He's only going to be there for, 27 hours? Is it highly symbolic, though, do you think?
I think it is. It was planned before the latest bloodshed, but the Vatican and the Pope decided to continue with it afterwards, not to be put off. I think he's trying to send a very strong signal of solidarity with beleaguered Christians here in Egypt. He said before travelling, Pope Francis himself said before travelling, that he wanted to send a message of comfort and encouragement to Christians in the Middle East, because, of course, it's not only here in Egypt, but also in other parts of the Middle East like Iraq and Syria and Libya that Christians are facing particular dangers. So that was very much part of his plan, to demonstrate with them that he was willing to walk in the same path. But another key issue for him is the question of reconciliation and dialogue between the faiths. He particularly believes that now more than ever it is crucial to have a dialogue between the Christian community and Islamic leaders, and to try to work together to combat Islamic extremism. He's been repairing relations with senior figures, senior Islamic leaders, and he himself will visit Al-Azhar, which is the 1,000-year-old centre of Sunni Muslim theology. He'll be the first pope to ever visit that location.
That was Orla Guerin in Egypt. The Venezuelan opposition leader Enrique Capriles has given an interview to the BBC in which he accuses President Maduro of inflicting savage repression on the Venezuelan people. Nearly 30 people have been killed in anti-government protests this month, and the economy is beset by shortages and inflation. The government says the protests in Venezuela have been organised by the right-wing elite to seize power by undemocratic means, and it's banned Mr. Capriles from political office for 15 years. But Mr. Capriles said his country is living under an authoritarian government.
They took away from us the recall referendum. They took away our regional elections. The presidential elections have no date. There is no electoral calendar. We're the only country in the Americas where you ask when the elections are and there's no answer. How do people express themselves in a democracy? with a vote. We ask for a humanitarian channel to bring medicines and food that is being offered to us by many democratic governments. We ask for the freedom of political prisoners and an end to political sanctions.
Mr. Capriles also called for an immediate general election.
To solve the political crisis, the ideal would be a general election. If we start accepting in Latin America governments with these characteristics, dictatorships, this will spread. There is the risk, the temptation to others to follow the same steps. See the case of Bolivian President Evo Morales, who is trying to change the constitution to stay in power. That's unacceptable. When is this going to stop? Well, I don't see people stopping fighting for their country. What would I want? That in 24 hours, as soon as possible, the government would wake up, would have some sort of conscience and sense, and would call for elections, free and democratic ones, with international observers. It's done. We should fight no longer. We can ask Venezuelans and see what they want.
The Venezuelan opposition leader Enrique Capriles. A row has broken out in Ireland over plans to relocate the National Maternity Hospital to another site, which will be owned solely by nuns, the religious Sisters of Charity. The Irish Department of Health says it's confident that the hospital board will be independent and that there are good safeguards in place. But a former chief of the hospital and chairman of the Institute of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, Dr. Peter Boylan, has resigned in protest. He told Dan Damon why.
Any Catholic organisation has serious ethical issues with a lot of what goes on in modern maternity care. And the Sisters' health philosophy and ethical code specifically bans things like IVF, sterilisation, abortion, etc. And these, of course, are part and parcel of the daily work of any maternity service. So I've been speaking out about this at the board for a long time, since an agreement was struck between the two hospitals. And I felt that this was just completely inappropriate. But controversy erupted in the media here in Ireland when it became apparent that the hospital would be 100% owned by the Sisters of Charity. They also have a serious problem in their history of abuse of women during pregnancy and of child abuse and so on, which is well known around the world with a lot of Catholic organisations.
You tell the story of how in the 1980s, when you were performing certain procedures, sterilizations, for example, the Archbishop called you in. What did he say?
Yes, this happened when I was master of the hospital and we were introducing sterilisation, and the Archbishop called me up to his palace and sat me down with another bishop and said, "You can't be doing this, it's not medically indicated." And I said, "Well, I'm terribly sorry, Your Grace, but we are doing it." And he said, "Well, you're going to have to stop doing it." And I said, "Well, I'm terribly sorry, Your Grace, we're not. Women want this, they need it. It is medically indicated. I'm a doctor, and so we are going to continue doing it." And basically we had to face him down and continued on doing what women needed.
OK, well, that was then, the 1980s, but this is now. Surely attitudes in Ireland have changed. I mean, gay marriage was legalised not long ago. So moral attitudes and the control that the church might have had over civil morality has changed. How does that then not work through to the health system?
Well, unfortunately, a lot of hospitals are owned by the religious in Ireland for historical reasons. The state effectively handed over education and health to the religious orders. The government have started saying that they are looking at divesting ownership of hospitals and schools from the church back into state ownership. But at the same time, they're planning to give a new 300 million maternity hospital, of all things, to a religious order of nuns.
But there's no doubt you need a new maternity hospital, don't you? I'm told that the one that exists is appalling. The doctors and nurses do their best, but the building's falling apart.
That's slightly overstating it. There's a new neonatal intensive care unit, new operating theatres, new fetal medicine unit have recently been built, and there's a lot of alterations going on in the hospital. However, it definitely does need to be replaced, and it needs to go beside the St. Vincent's Hospital, which is a large general hospital with all tertiary care. But Ireland has become a much more open society. It's a lot more secular, and while all religious beliefs obviously need to be respected and so on, it's fundamentally wrong for the state to invest 300 million of state money into a maternity hospital and then grant ownership to the religious. It's just not on.
How much is the idea that existed not long ago that a woman's body was not her right to control, that there was this overwhelming power, the church? How much has that attitude gone? How much does it still prevail?
Well, among the general population, it has changed significantly, but unfortunately the government are very slow to catch up with the people in terms of legislation. For example, there's no legal construct around IVF, although it is widely available in the country. It's very available in the National Maternity Hospital, for example. It has the only not-for-profit IVF unit in the country. But under the nuns' ownership of the hospital, it would simply be impossible to transfer that unit.
That was Dr. Peter Boylan. And that's almost it for this edition of the Global News podcast. But before we go, it's time for News from Elsewhere, our regular roundup of some of the less reported stories from around the world. And taking us through them is Paul Brown from BBC Monitoring. So, Paul, being British, let's start with a weather story.
Hi, Jackie. Yes, how about this for a headline to get us started? Exploding snowman forecasts hot summer for Switzerland. This Monday, Switzerland celebrated the Spring Festival of Seckerslauten, an annual event which sees hundreds of horses parade through the streets of Zurich, then around a bonfire, on top of which sits the Berg, who's a snowman who represents winter. Now, the Berg looks like any traditional snowman, coal eyes, carrot nose, all of that. But there's one fundamental difference. He has a head full of firecrackers. And tradition states that the faster it takes for his head to explode, the warmer the forthcoming summer will be.
So how long did it take?
This year he clocked in at 9 minutes and 56 seconds, according to the Swiss newspaper The Local, and that's pretty fast. Last year it took almost 3/4 of an hour for Berg to burn up. The festival has raised concerns in recent years. Animal lovers are worried that the horses taking part in the fiery festival may become distressed. However, as the Swiss Info website reports, veterinary students at the University of Zurich monitored the heart rates of several horses in last year's event and found that they were only moderately stressed. Maybe they were worried about the forecast.
Now then, on to a beauty contest with a difference.
Yes, around 200 contestants have taken part in a competition to find Pakistan's most beautiful Azikeli buffalo. Farmers and breeders gathered in Mingora, which is the capital of Pakistan's northern Swat district, for the 3-day event, according to the Dawn newspaper. It was funded by USAID, which is the American government's civilian foreign aid agency. They stumped up the first prize of 75,000 rupees. That's about $715. The money was won by Lake Badar, who is very happy with his herd. He said, "I have 10 buffaloes of the same breed, which are the source of our livelihood. Today I am proud that my buffalo won the first prize."
So they sound like very special animals.
Oh, absolutely. I've seen some pictures. These are some hot buffalo.
We should definitely tweet some pictures then.
An official from the country's livestock ministry told the Associated Press of Pakistan news agency that the breed is facing extinction and that this event is aimed at creating awareness among people about the importance of breeding the animal. The Azikeli buffalo is only found in Swat, and it's said to be the only breed adapted to the region's cold weather, meaning that owners don't have to sell or slaughter them when the winter approaches. Experts at the beauty competition said the breed was not only beautiful, but also produced more milk and better meat.
So from the beautiful buffalo of Pakistan to Tajikistan.
Yeah, this is a story that might be close to your heart, actually, Jackie, because it's about difficulties that news presenters have to deal with.
I don't know what you mean.
A new rule has come into force in Tajikistan, which forces state-run TV and radio stations to refer to President Emomali Rahmon by his official title, which is pretty lengthy. This means that news reports about the country's leader must refer to him as, deep breath, the founder of peace and national unity, leader of the nation, President of the Republic of Tajikistan, His Excellency Emomali Rahmon. Now, we did some research on this. It takes a full 15 seconds for that name to scroll across the screen in the main TV news. And while some journalists seem to be able to get away with referring to him simply as leader of the nation, the head of the state broadcaster has said media outlets must follow this rule in all official reports. The same rule is also being applied to government news agencies and websites.
I bet social media love this story.
Oh, yes, absolutely. They had a lot of fun with this one. Users have offered further titles such as the magnificent ruler of the Tajiks, the creator of the universe, and the man in the moon, which is a bit of an odd one. Others in Tajikistan argue that the country has more pressing problems to deal with than bestowing elegant titles on its leader. One Facebook user said, "Provide all of your citizens with jobs and stability, and then call yourself whatever you want." Now, these honorary titles are not uncommon in Central Asia. Kazakh media refer to President Nursultan Nazarbayev as Yelbasi, or leader of the nation.
And I also gather that in Turkmenistan, President Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov goes by Arkadag, which I think means protector.
That's correct. That's absolutely right.
Thank you for that, Paul. That was Paul Brown of BBC Monitoring, or as he shall henceforth be known, His Excellency Paul Brown, the High Panjandrum of news from elsewhere and benign overlord of BBC Monitoring. And that's it from us for now, but there'll be an updated version of the Global News podcast later. If you would like to comment on this podcast or the topics covered in it, or you want to send us a picture of where you listen to the Global News podcast, just send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. You'll also find us on Twitter and Instagram. I'm Jackie Leonard. Until next time, goodbye.